The sky was burning. Eris Dain had seen battle before, but nothing like this. A dozen dragons tore through the storm-lit heavens, their riders clashing in mid-air, steel flashing, magic igniting in bursts of crimson and gold. Lightning licked the clouds, illuminating a battlefield drenched in fire and blood. Below, the scorched earth was littered with bodies, both human and beast. Varian twisted beneath her, his massive black wings cutting through the smoke-laced air. His obsidian scales gleamed in the firelight, his powerful muscles coiling as he banked hard, narrowly dodging the serrated tail of an enemy beast. The rider atop it barely had time to react before Eris struck. Her blade cut through the air, slicing across the enemy's chest. The man choked, gasping in pain as he tumbled from his saddle, his dragon shrieking in fury. Eris had no time to watch him fall. She was already scanning the battlefield. There, a rider in blood-red armour, gliding through the chaos with deadly precision. The commander himself. She exhaled sharply, fingers tightening around the hilt of her sword. "Now, Varian!" Her dragon obeyed without hesitation, diving like a falling star. Wind tore at her face, the scent of burning flesh thick in the air as she closed the distance, her sword raised, her heart pounding. She would end this, and then just as she was about to strike, the bond snapped. Pain, raw, blinding, as if her soul had been ripped in half. One moment she was flying, connected, whole. The next she was falling. Her body twisted violently mid-air, arms flailing as she reached for Varian's saddle. But he was gone. The air roared past her ears, drowning out the battlefield above. Her dragon was gone. No, this couldn't be happening. She reached out for the bond, for the connection that had always been there, the tether that had bound them since the moment they had met. Nothing. A void, cold and absolute. Eris barely had time to register the horror before gravity took hold. The sky flipped violently around her. Her stomach lurched. Wind clawed at her, tearing her from the battle, dragging her toward the broken earth below. No one was coming for her. No one was diving after her. And for the first time in her life, Eris Dain knew what it felt like to be abandoned. The ground rushed toward her and she braced herself. Impact. Then darkness. She woke to silence. Not the cold silence of death, but something deeper. A silence that stretched, vast and suffocating, pressing against her skin. Pain laced through her body, but she was alive. Somehow. Her fingers brushed against rough stone. Her armour was cracked but still clung to her body, dented and scorched. Her sword gone. She blinked. A faint glow pulsed along the cavern walls, casting eerie shadows across the jagged rock. The air was damp, thick with the scent of earth and something else. Ash. Where was she? The last thing she remembered was falling. No one had caught her. No one had... A sound. Footsteps. She stiffened. Finally awake, a voice rasped. Eris snapped her gaze toward the sound. A figure stood just beyond the light. A man. Tall, broad-shouldered, clad in worn leather armour. A scar ran from his jaw to his brow, old and jagged. And on his wrist, a sigil. Her breath caught. Not the sigil of the Empire. The mark of the exiled riders. "You should be dead," the man said, tilting his head slightly. "Most who fall from the sky don't survive the landing." Eris didn't move, didn't blink. "You're one of them," she said coldly. The man smirked. "And you, Eris Dain, are not where you're supposed to be." She forced her voice to stay level. "Where am I?" "Below," he said simply. "Beneath the battlefield. Beneath the empire that sent you to die." She ignored that last part. "And you're alive because we were left to rot," another voice cut in. Eris turned. More figures emerged from the shadows, riders, some in tattered uniforms, some bearing scars that should have been fatal. Some standing next to dragons. Dragons that should have been dead. Her pulse hammered in her throat. "This isn't possible." "And yet," the man with the scar said, "here we are." Eris struggled to make sense of it. The exiled riders were legends. Ghost stories whispered among cadets. Traitors, deserters, disgraced soldiers who had vanished from history. They weren't supposed to be real. "You think we're the enemy?" one of them said, stepping forward. A woman with sharp, dark eyes. "But tell me, Eris Dain, if we are, then why did your empire let you fall?" A sharp ache lanced through her chest. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. She had seen the commander's eyes in those last moments, had seen his hand move toward his rune, had seen... No, she shoved the thought away. The empire did not betray its own. And yet, something flickered at the edge of her memory, something that didn't make sense. The silence from Varian. The way he had not fought to reach her. The moment the bond was severed. "You're lying," she said, voice tight. The scarred man watched her closely. "You sure about that?" A shadow moved behind him, Eris went still. Then, stepping into the faint glow of firelight, a dragon emerged. She staggered back. She knew this dragon. Not Varian. No, but another. A dragon who had died 3 years ago. A dragon she had watched burn on the Empire's own pyres. Her breath came short, sharp. No, this wasn't possible. And yet, the dragon's golden eyes locked onto hers. And Eris Dain, captain of the Empire's Sky Legion, knew, with bone-deep certainty, everything she had fought for was a lie. Eris Dain had faced death before, but never like this. The dragon standing before her should not exist. 3 years ago, she had watched it burn. Watched its massive crimson body consumed by flames, its cries echoing across the sky fortress as the Empire ensured that no trace of it remained. And yet here it stood, alive. The dragon's golden eyes locked onto hers, intelligent and knowing, as if it recognized her. A chill slithered down her spine. She took a step back, heart hammering. This is impossible. The man with the scar, the leader of these so-called exiled riders, sighed as if he had heard these words too many times before. You believe only what the Empire allows you to believe, he said. You've seen the truth with your own eyes and still you deny it? Eris clenched her jaw. Her entire life the Empire had been absolute. It was law, it was order, it was truth. If what these exiles were saying was real, then everything she had fought for, everything she had sacrificed, had been built on a lie. She exhaled sharply. If this is some kind of trick, it's a poor one. The scarred man stepped closer, and the firelight cast deep shadows over his face. His voice was lower now, edged with something like pity. No trick, he said. Just a truth you were never meant to find. Eris's pulse pounded. This couldn't be happening. She needed a moment to think, to process. She glanced around, taking in her surroundings for the first time. The cavern stretched far beyond what she had initially seen, its walls lined with massive stone arches, each flickering with dimly burning torches. The ceiling was high, jagged with black rock, and here and there she spotted dragons resting on carved-out ledges, their massive bodies coiled like silent sentinels. Dozens of them. All alive. It didn't make sense. The Empire had strict laws. Dragons and their riders who defied orders were executed, their bodies burned, their names erased from the records. And yet, Eris turned back to the scarred man. Who are you? He studied her for a long moment, then finally spoke. My name is Rebecca Yarros, he said, and once I was a commander just like you. Eris stiffened. That name. She had heard it before. Rebecca Yarros had been one of the Empire's greatest warriors, a legend, a hero, until the Empire declared him a traitor. His name had been stricken from the records. His execution had been public. She had not seen his body burn, but she had seen his dragon's wings pinned to the fortress gates, a warning to all who might question the Empire. You're dead, Eris whispered. Riven smirked. Clearly not. Her breath came fast and shallow. This was too much. The lost dragons, the exiled riders, the dead standing before her. None of it should be real. And yet she was here, alive. Varian was gone. The bond was severed. No one had come for her. And now, she was trapped among the very people she had spent her life hunting. Eris forced her voice to steady. If you're alive, if all of this is real, then what does that mean for me? Riven's expression darkened. It means you were never meant to leave this place. A prickle of warning traced down her spine. He wasn't saying it as a threat. He was saying it as a truth. The Empire had let her fall, and they had never intended for her to rise again. Her stomach twisted. No, it wasn't possible. Unless... She thought back to that last moment, to the commander's eyes, the way he had touched his rune, the sharp crack of pain before the bond was gone. He had done something to her. He had severed her bond. Her hands curled into fists. They abandoned me, Riven nodded once. And now you have a choice. Eris forced down the rising fury. What choice? The woman with sharp dark eyes stepped forward. You can rot here, waiting for an empire that won't come for you. Or, Riven added, you can help us burn it down. The words struck her like a blade. Eris had never once considered turning against the Empire, but the Empire had turned against her. Her throat tightened. Why should I believe anything you say? Riven exhaled, stepping aside. Because I'm going to show you what they never wanted you to see. He turned and began walking deeper into the cavern. The other riders moved aside, their gazes heavy on her. Eris hesitated. Then reluctantly she followed. The cavern walls began to shift as they walked. The rough stone gave way to something carved, Ancient symbols lined the walls, glowing faintly with light. A chill crawled over her skin. These symbols, she had seen them before, deep in the Sky Fortress in the Forbidden Archives. They were the language of the first riders. Riven stopped in front of an archway. It led into a vast chamber lined with dragon eggs. Eris inhaled sharply. Hundreds of them stretching as far as the eye could see. Some small and pale, others massive, their shells veined with gold and silver. Impossible. The Empire controlled all dragon hatcheries. The Empire had always controlled them. But here, these dragons had never been touched by the Empire's hand. She turned to Riven, heart pounding. How? He watched her closely. The Empire has been lying to you, Eris. To all of us. He gestured to the eggs. They don't want you to know that dragons existed before the Empire. That bonds were not meant to be controlled. That riders were once chosen by the dragons, not by men. Eris's stomach twisted, because suddenly she remembered. She remembered the first time she had touched Varian's scales. The way he had spoken to her, not in words but in something deeper, something unbreakable, something that had been taken from her. She clenched her fists. If the Empire had done this to her, how many others had they done it to? Riven stepped closer. You feel it now, don't you? He said softly. Eris exhaled shakily. She did. The truth, the weight of it pressing down on her. Rage, the grief, the betrayal, and beneath it all, a growing, undeniable certainty. The Empire had cast her aside. Now she would tear it down. Eris Dain had spent her life serving the Empire. Now she would be the one to bring it down. She stood before the rows of dragon eggs, their faint glow casting soft shadows across the cavern walls. Hundreds of them. A secret buried beneath the Empire's reach, pulsing with power. Each egg represented a truth the Empire had stolen. Each one was a future the Empire had tried to erase. Eris clenched her fists. She had spent years believing she had earned her bond with Varian, that the Sky Fortress had given her its blessing, that the Empire had chosen her because she was worthy. But it had never been about worth. Varian had not chosen her. He had been assigned to her. The Empire had bound them together, not through destiny, but through control. And when she had become a threat, when her power had grown beyond what they could manage, they had ripped her bond away as easily as a butcher's knife. She sucked in a breath, steadying herself. Riven Kane studied her from the other side of the chamber, his sharp eyes unreadable. You feel it now, he said quietly. Eris turned to him. You knew, he nodded. We all learnt the same way. We all fell before we understood the truth. She exhaled slowly, the weight of his words settling deep in her chest. She wasn't the first. She wouldn't be the last. The Empire would keep doing this, silencing those who grew too strong, killing riders who dared to ask why. And now they had Varian. A sharp pain lanced through her ribs. Not physical, something deeper. The severed bond still ached, like a wound that refused to close. It had taken him from her. She had to get him back. Eris lifted her gaze to Riven. How do I find him? Something flickered in his eyes. You're certain? She gave him a look. He almost smiled. Then we start tonight. The exiled riders moved like ghosts. Eris followed them through the winding tunnels, her boots barely making a sound against the stone. They moved with precision, years of surviving beneath the Empire's notice shaping their every step. She had spent her life hunting them. Now she was one of them. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it settled deep inside her, solid as steel. The truth had set fire to everything she had known, and now she would let it burn. They reached a carved-out war room, its walls lined with old maps, scattered weapons and plans. A strategy, a rebellion. Eris scanned the maps, her eyes narrowing. The Sky Fortress was marked in thick black ink. A prison. Her stomach twisted. Varian was inside. She looked at Riven. You know where they're keeping him? His jaw tightened. We have spies in the fortress. Your dragon is alive, but he won't be for long. Eris inhaled sharply. They're trying to break him, Riven continued. They do it slowly. Take away his fire, his wings, his mind. They will hollow him out until he is nothing but a weapon under their control. A cold rage settled inside her. They were torturing him. They had torn them apart. And soon, if she did nothing, he would forget her. A dragon's bond was not just connection. It was memory. She gritted her teeth. How soon can we move? Riven's lips curled. That's the right question. Night fell over the Sky Fortress. Eris crouched in the shadows, the cold wind cutting against her exposed skin. This was familiar. Infiltration, stealth, precision. Except this time, she was not an agent of the Empire. She was its enemy. The exiled riders flanked her, their dark armour blending into the cliffs. Below, the fortress stretched wide, its towers sharp against the night sky. She knew this place. Had walked its halls, sworn her loyalty within its walls. Now she would tear them down. Her pulse pounded. Varian was here. She felt it in her bones. A silent signal from Riven, and they moved. First wave was quick. 2 guards, dead before they could scream. Their bodies pulled into the shadows. The second was slower. A sentry spotted them, but before he could raise the alarm, Eris's dagger was in his throat. They slipped inside. The walls smelled of iron and oil. Torches flickered against stone. Every hallway burned with familiarity. She had lived here. She had trusted this place. And now she walked through it like a stranger. The fortress prison was below the east tower. She knew this because she had sent people there herself. Eris swallowed back the bile rising in her throat. She reached the lower chambers, her breath steady despite the sharp pulse of her heart. The guards at the prison doors barely had time to react before the exiled riders descended on them. A short struggle, a muffled scream, then silence. Eris shoved the doors open. And there, in the centre of the chamber, Varian. Her breath hitched. Chains wrapped around his massive form, his dark scales dull beneath the flickering light. His wings clipped, his talons bound, and his eyes. They were distant, empty. A deep wrenching pain tore through Eris's chest. "No," she whispered. She rushed forward. Varian didn't move. Throat tightened. He wasn't responding. They had severed the bond. For good. She pressed a hand against his scales. "Varian," she said softly. "It's me." Nothing. The rage came fast, unchecked, violent. Eris whirled on Riven. "How do I fix this?" He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You can't," he said. Her pulse spiked. "What?" "They cut him from you," Riven said, voice steady. "His mind is gone, he is—" "No." The word left her lips before she realised she had spoken. Her hands curled into fists. She refused to believe that. She had lost everything. She would not lose him. Eris took a breath, steadied herself. Then she closed her eyes, reached for him. Nothing. Deeper. Nothing. And then a flicker. A pulse of something. A memory. She latched onto it, pouring herself into the space where their bond had once been. It was faint. Distant. But it was him. Eris clenched her jaw. They had tried to erase her, tried to erase them. But they had failed. She opened her eyes. Varian blinked. And then slowly he remembered.